Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. Really excited to jump into something I haven't really played with a ton in the past, but I've always been fascinated with, and that's the UI collection view. I'm kind of an old school tables guy, but I really wanted to get into this control. So in this episode, we're gonna look at the most basic type of UI collection view you can have, something called flow layout, and we're gonna see how it works. We're gonna do that by starting with something very simple over here, just a simple flow layout that brings some cells going across the screen. We'll then see how to transform that into more of a table view-like looking thing. And then finally, we'll look at how to add some headers and footers to your UI table view flow layout, just to see what it looks like to actually work with the mechanics of that. Okay, let's begin. So UI Collection View has actually been with us since about 2012, but I was really surprised to understand that until last year, it only shipped with one concrete implementation, and that's something called flow layout. So the main difference between the collection view and the table view, although they have very similar APIs, is that when you hear table view, think lists and rows. With a collection view, it's a little bit more like cells. You can think of it as text flowing. So with the one concrete implementation that we get with UI collection view, something called flow layout, what you'll see is it renders its cells going left to right down the page, just like text. Now there is another type of layout we're going to look at in a next episode, something called a compositional layout. But for this video, we're just going to start very simple. We're going to build a view just like this one on the right, and then we're going to progressively make it a little bit more complex. And I'm going to show you how to style and do layout the UI collection view way. So as we go through here, you'll see how we can customize some layouts. We can change the different cell sizes. There's a scroll direction. We can alter things like spacing. But ultimately, we're going to see how we can take this really neat way of displaying cells and do some basic layout with it, and really just to familiarize ourselves with the mechanics. So let's jump into the lab now and create a brand new collection view using flow layout. Okay, so if you haven't already, go ahead and fire up Xcode, hit Shift-Command-N to create a new project. We're going to create a brand new single view app. This one I'm going to call Demo Flow Layout. And we don't need core data unit tests or anything like that. I'm going to hit next, and I'm going to stick that on my desktop, and bang, when we do that, we should get a brand new project created for us, ready to go. I'm just going to do a little bit of resizing here to fill up the screen. Actually, maybe I'll go to here. And just for kicks, if we go Command R, we can run our application, and let's just verify that we get a simulator up. So if I go Option Command 0, I can get rid of this thing on the right. Here's my view controller here. And if we bring up the simulator, we should get a blank simulator, and that's good. Okay, we're good to go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do to start this off is let's just define what it is we're going to create here. And this is something that we're going to call this is going to be our collection view. So we're just going to go ahead and define it here. So we're just in a simple view controller. We're going to create our own collection view, and we're going to instantiate it. And we're going to instantiate it in the view load view method. So I'm just going to go ahead and type out our override of load view. And when we get in there, this is where we want to load the view for our view controller. So we always want to call super here, just to make sure we're calling the parent. And then down here, let's actually instantiate and create a collection view and then assign it to this variable that we just defined up here. So let's go I'm just going to call it CV to make it a little bit shorter so it fits in the screen better. And let's create a brand new UI collection view using this constructor here, the one that takes a frame. We're going to pass in a frame of 0. And this is where we can also specify concretely what type of layout we're using. And in this case, we want to use our collection view flow layout. If I go Command 0, I can get rid of that area on the left here. And I need to instantiate that. So right away, this is the first thing we're really sending here. This is us telling our collection view we want to use the flow layout here. And that's the most basic default one. Believe it or not, this was actually the only concrete layout that you got with Collection View until last year when compositional came in. And we're going to look at that in the next episode. But for us right now, this is where we define the type of layout we want for our collection view. And there is another type called a custom type where if we wanted to create our own layout, we could pass that in here and set that here too. We're not going to be looking at creating our own custom layouts, but this is where you'd specify that also. So let's create our collection view, our flow layout collection view like this. And the way I'm going to lay this out in the view is we're going to do it using auto layout. So what's the number one rule when we're doing auto layout? We always have to remember to set our translates auto resizing mask into constraint to false. There's multiple ways we could put this up in the view controller, but we're just going to do it with auto layout. And then we're going to add our collection view that we just created to the sub view. So that's ready to go. And now here we want to set up some constraints. So let's set up and activate some constraints here. Let's go like this. Let's say, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to take our collection view and we're actually going to pin it to the top, the leading, the trailing, and the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and plunk those all in there. And I will save us maybe just a little bit of time here to save you having to watch me type everything out. I'm just going to plunk that in here. So what we're really doing here is we're saying this collection view we just created, let's use auto layout and pin it to the top, bottom, leading, trailing of the view that we're in for this view controller. And that's just going to flush it out and fill the whole screen basically. So if we run this now by going Command R, we'll see that there isn't anything in there yet. That's because we haven't really set up or done anything with our collection view. All we've done is instantiated. So let's head down here now to View Did Load. Let's do a little bit more. Let's now do some work with our collection view. Let's give it a nice background of white. So we'll go background color is equal to .system. Actually, I think we just go .white. And let's also now, the way the collection view works is just like a table view. It has a delegate and a data source. So the delegate is the protocol callback where basically the collection view says, hey, certain events happen on me, like someone tapped this cell or certain events happen. That's how I call back into you. And it also has a data source where it's going to ask us for how many rows, how many sections, what's the data that I need so I can lay out my collection view. So in here, this is where we can register ourselves as our data source. So we can set ourselves up as the data source. And we can also set ourselves up as the delegate. And let's do one more thing. This is really interesting. Don't worry about these. We'll fix these in a second. Unlike table view, which has a default cell that we can work with UICollectionView, you have to provide your own cell. There's no default cell there for you to work with. So you really have to define your own. So what we can do here in order to give ourselves a cell is we can register a cell that we haven't created yet. I'm just going to type it out here so you can see what it looks like, and then we'll create the cell after. But I'm going to register, and this is something you do quite a bit. We're going to create a cell called myCell, and we're going to pass ourself in here. And then we're going to need, just like in table view, a string identifier that uniquely identifies this cell so we can reuse it just like it would in a table view. So I don't know if you remember in table view, iOS is really efficient. When you have thousands of rows, every time it creates a row in that table cell, it puts it in a pool and reuses it. That's what these reuse identifiers for. So it doesn't have to actually create 10,000 of these things. It can just create 10 or 15 and then reuse them as the user scrolls. Very similar concept here with UICollectionView. We're going to create our own cells. It's going to pool them, and then we're going to pull them out with this identifier. Now let's go ahead and create our own cell down here. And let's do it line by line just to see what this looks like. I'm just going to include it right in the file here. Let's go class, myCell. Now watch what I extend here. This is a UICollectionView cell. This is the type of cell we're going to use, obviously, with UI collection views. So in here, we can define a very basic cell that just has, in this case, I'm just going to create one with a label. And we're just going to give it some very simple text and initialize it. So when you create your own cell like this, you have to override the init. So I'm going to override the init method, which happens to be of this kind here, cgrect. And like all overrides, we almost always at the very beginning want to call super. So I'm going to go frame.frame here. And now we can actually, write out this label and build it. So let's create a label here. We're going to use AutoLayout again, so let's remember to turn that translate masks into constraint off. And then what I'm going to do here is set the content view. In other words, this is the contents of this view. We're going to add to it our label. That's going to be the only thing in this view here. And then we're going to do some more layout constraints. And just to save a little bit of typing, I'm going to just copy in the constraints here. And what we're basically saying here is very similar to what we did at the top with the collection view. We're saying this label, its top anchor, we're going to pin it to the top of our content view. And its bottom anchor, we're going to pin to the bottom. Its leading and trailing, we're going to pin to the leading and trailing of the content view. And what that's really saying is our label now is going to be pinned and stretched to completely fill this content view that we're in here for this collection view cell. So that's just going to stretch it out, have it fill up. We're doing auto layout here. And then because we've created the label here, but we need to assign it to our variable instance here. Let's just go now text label is equal to the label we just created. And let's just give it a little bit of styling here. Let's give the content view a background color. Let's make it light gray. Actually, I'm going to go system. I'll just go light gray, I guess. And then let's also center that label, just so it looks a little bit nice. We're going to text align it so it sits right in the center here. And there we go. Oh, and it's because we are implementing this as a view, and basically this is showing up this required initializer. This is really to work with storyboards, which our view does not. We're doing this all programmatically without storyboards. We just need to implement this required initializer here. So if we needed to write ourselves to disk, we could, but we're not worrying about that here. And there we now have a cell which can be used in our collection view cell. So now when we come back up here, this line starts to make a lot more sense. So what we can see we're doing here is we're registering ourselves, this cell that we just created, with this reuse identifier, and that's what we're going to use in our collection view to lay ourselves out. That's how we define the cell. Okay, now we need to basically make our view controller look like and basically give it the protocol so it can act as a data source and delegate for our collection view. That's why this guy's complaining. So a nice way to do that is just to come down here and start it off as an extension on our own view controller. So we're just going to go extension view controller, UICollectionView, delegate. Actually, let's start with the data source. That's the more interesting one for us right now. And in here, we're going to implement methods so that we can basically say, hey, we act as a data source. Now you can see it's telling us quite nicely, hey, you don't conform to this protocol. Would you like me to stub these in? To which I'll say, sure. And what it did here is it filled in two methods. These are the two required protocols we need to implement to support a data source. So let's take a look at what these are saying. Number of items in section. So this is much like the UI table view. We need to say basically how many rows, or in our case, list items, are we going to have in our collection view. So I'm going to start off by just hard coding this just to say 10. There's going to be 10 things in our collection view. That's just the number here. If we're using an array as a data source, I could query the array for its count. But here I'm just going to hard code just 10 just to keep this as simple as possible. Then it's also saying, hey, cell for item at. Okay, well, here's where we need to actually put in our cell and define how it's going to work. But before we do that, I want to show you just one more optional call here. This is the number of sections. So this was optional for us, but just like in a table view, we can also have multiple sections in a collection view. This is where we would specify that. And I'm just going to return 1 here just to show you what that looks like. Also notice how I don't need the return type here. I'm going to put return there. This is something new in Swift. I don't think you actually need returns in all of these. It's kind of built into the latest version of Swift. So I can actually even go like this. Although I'm kind of used to seeing the returns, so I think I'm just going to leave them in there. Okay, but let's take a look at this cell for item at. What are we really doing here? Well, this is where we want to reuse and dequeue a cell, the my cell that we just created, and have our table view use that over and over again. So if you're familiar with table view, it's going to look very similar. What we're going to do here is we're going to define a cell, And we're going to use this very similar looking syntax from table view for collection view, where it's DQ usable cell with reuse identifier. And for us, this identifier is my cell. I should probably make a variable for this so I don't have to duplicate this, but I'll just leave it like this for now. And for index path, this is going to be the index path that's filled in. Let me just fix you. And here it's our index path that's filled in. So this tells us what row or item list we basically have. And from there, we can get our cell. Now we do want the cell to be of a specific type. So I'm just going to come in here and hard code it to be my cell. That's the type that we want to. And I'm going to assume that we have this cell here. This cell is ready to be used. And now we can do something interesting with it, like set its text label. So remember, our cell down here has a text label. Now we're just going to set some text on it. And all we're going to do in this case is set the text to be a string representing our index row. And because it is 0 indexed and the first row or item starts with 0, I'm just going to add a 1 here to make it a 1. Oh, and that has to be index path. That will set some text, and then all we do is return this cell. Okay, now there's just one more complaint up here. It's basically saying, hey, you're not acting as a collection view delegate. So in order to satisfy this, let's do the same thing we did with our data source. Let's come down here and extend our view controller. And this time we're going to implement that UI collection data source. Sorry, delegate. So there we go, extension view controller UI view delegate. We're ready to implement that. And at this point, we are ready to compile. And let's just see what that looks like. So if we go Command R and we run this, hey, there we go. Our very first collection view using a simple flow layout. It just starts in the upper left here, and just like text, it flows until it hits the end, and then it repeats. And if we put 100 here, it would just snake down this page just like this. And that is the flow line-based layout in its simplest form. Congratulations, you just created your very first collection view flow layout. The rest is just gravy. What we're going to do now is we're going to take this and we're just going to show you some of the affordances or layout controls you have over specifying this. Before we leave this, I should just comment on one thing. By default, these cell sizes are 50-50. That's just the item size for a collection view cell here. That's nothing I specified. It's not even looking at the intrinsic size of these labels. If I made this label really big, for instance, if I put 100 characters in here, it would just compress it. That's just the default size. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take this and we're going to make it look a little bit more like a table view. We're going to transform it into something that looks like this. So we're going to start working with our basic collection view, and we're going to see how we can use the UI collection view layout delegate to actually control what's going on the page here. Hey, welcome back everybody. In part 2 here, we're going to take this very simple UI collection view, which does a simple flow layout, and convert it into something that looks more like this. Now you may be wondering, well, why would I want to do that? Why wouldn't I just use a simple table view? And you're right, in a lot of cases, a simple UI table view is more than enough. But let's still go through the mechanics because there's some neat things that collection views can do that table views can't. And as we go and transform this simple flow into a more linear scrollable flow, you'll see what a few of those things are. Now to help us out here, let's take a look and just review in some of the good Apple documentation here what is actually going on and what some of the things we can do when we're styling and laying out our flow layout. So first of all, we understand the flow layout does this left to right kind of a flow, much like text on a page. And this is our scrolling direction here. And in part 3, we'll take a look at headers and footers. But for now, one thing to appreciate with the collection view is you can size each cell differently. So that's one of the advantages, and that's sometimes why you see UI Collection View used on things like photo browsing or photo sharing applications. You can have pictures of different sizes and you can scroll them in really cool ways. Okay, that's neat. But we're also going to take a look at how you can control the spacing between your cells and your items. We'll look at the line spacing. So as we go from row to row, we'll see how we can control that. And then there's also this thing called using section insets to tweak your margins. So insets is a really key word you'll hear used a lot in iOS. It often talks about how much you can push your view in from your outer bounds of whatever view you're working with. So in this case here with the collection view, we're going to see how we can add some top, left, and bottom spacing to our layout and just tweak some of these things. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's now jump into the code and see what that looks like. Okay, so the way we start by transforming this is it turns out that flow and layout is actually a delegate in the UI collection view. This is something different from table view. So what we can do to take a look at some of the affordances and things we can do here is this is another extension that we're going to put on our view controller here. Only this one, just look at the name of this. It's the UI collection view delegate flow layout. And this is a delegate, a protocol delegate callback that's going to ask us, how would you like to style this thing? How much spacing do you want between your elements? How do you want each cell to be sized? And what do you ultimately want your insets or padding to be? Now, what's a little bit different is if you go look at the definition of this, you'll see that it actually extends UI collection view delegate. That's why we don't have to set ourselves up as another delegate just for flow layout. By virtue of us extending this, we are basically saying to be implemented with this call right here. So by collection view.delegate self, we're basically already registered as the delegate of this flow layout in addition to this one here. Okay, so let's take a look at what we can do here with a few of these. Let's start with one here, the cell size. I'm just going to copy this in just to save a little bit of typing. But let's break down what this actually is. This is us saying how big we would like our UI cell to be, each cell that's rendered here. And we're basically returning a size saying I'd like the width of the cell to go right across here and the height to be 120. So what does that look like? And if we apply that now, we get this. And here you can see we've got some nice spacing applied to each of our cells according to these rules we added here. And that really gives us the view that we were looking for. Now, if this is all we wanted, we could be done here. This could be our view. We'll happily have some space in here. But there's a few other things we can tweak. By default, if we don't specify what we would like the spacing between our elements here to be, it's going to use a default value of 10. And 10 happens to be something called the minimum line spacing that a view controller uses to separate out its sections. But we can control that. By implementing this method here in our delegate callback, minimum line spacing for section at, we can make it something much bigger. For example, here we could specify 80. And if we run the application now and see what that looks like, we can put a lot more space between each of these sections. Instead of it being a default of 10, we can control it and make it 80. And there's one more thing we can tweak here. We can also change the insets for each section. So the insets here, this is kind of an interesting one. Here, what we're basically saying is inset for section at, what that's actually going to control is the spacing between the header at the top here. And if we had a footer, the footer at the bottom. And if we run that, let's not use 8, let's make it something bigger. Let's also make this 80. Let's add 80 all around to the left, the bottom, the top, and the right. Let's run this and see what this looks like. And when we do, we can see we've got a big space here at the top. That represents our insets 80 on the top. And we also have something at the bottom here. That's an insets of 80 at the bottom. But notice we don't have it on the left and the right. I'm not actually sure why it doesn't respect the insets of 80 here. I think basically maybe the size for item at overrides whatever insets you've got here. I'm not exactly sure why, but even if I make these negative, it doesn't change the fact that it always wants to keep those widths going all the way to the full amount out, and it's only putting it at the top and the bottom. But if you do look at the documentation, it does give you some kinds of hints. So here we're taking a look at collection view inset for section at, and if you scroll down here, it does say as part of discussion that it is going to use the margins you apply here, but it only represents the distance between the header view and the first line of items and between the last line of items and the footer view, which is what we're seeing here. Here's our header view space and here's our footer view space. So it does say that it applies them to there, but I still don't have a great answer for why it doesn't apply to left and right here. But I suspect it has something to do just because of how they've implemented it here like this. So now we've gone from a simple flow layout where it was a grid, just like text flowing across the page, to something where we can control the layout a little bit more like this. For part 3 now, let's see what it would take to actually add a header and a footer view to our UI collection view. Feel free to take a pause here. When we come back, we'll jump into that section. Hey everyone, welcome back. In part 3 here, we're going to see how to add a header and footer view to our UI table view control. But let's just quickly recap what we've done. We started off with a very simple UI control view layout. Basically, it's the concrete implementation flow layout, simply like text, the cells getting laid out from left to right down our page. We then saw how we could use a flow layout delegate to actually control the styling of each of these cells. We can specify the size, we can control the spacing, and there's some things we can do here to basically space things out and even give it an inset spacing at the top and the bottom. And for part 3 here, now we're going to see how to take this spaced out UI collection view and actually give it a header and a footer. Okay, so let's begin. The key thing to remember when working with headers and footers on UI control views is that these are views and cells just like anything else. So what we can actually do in the code is take our previous cell that we used to lay out each of these cells here, these gray cells, and we can modify it to just be our header and our footer. So I'm just going to take our header and footer cell here, and just at the very top of my view controller, I'm going to define 2 more classes. One is going to be my header class, which is going to also extend UI collection view cell. And it's just going to contain a label just like it did before. Everything else here is going to be exactly the same. The only thing I'm going to tweak a little bit is I'm going to give that label some text to indicate that it is a header. And I'm also going to give it a system background color of blue just so we can separate it from our footer. So if we just take a look at what we've done here, this is just another collection view cell. This is going to be your header. This is the thing that's going to go at the top. It just has a single label in it, a text label. And that text label is auto layout out to the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. It's just going to fill that header out. We've given that label some text that says header, and we're going to color the background blue. So we've just really defined our header view at this point. And now we can do the same thing for our footer. I'm going to take that exact same class. And remember, we just have to create these views ourselves. So this is going to be our header view and our footer view. So I'm going to call this my footer class. It's going to do this exact same thing as header, only instead of saying header, you can probably guess what it's going to say. It's going to say footer, and we'll give it a nice background color of system green. So the key to getting these hooders and viewers to appear in our collection view is we somehow need to tell the collection view which header and footer to use. We need a way of tying our header and our green footer into the collection view, and the way we do that is through reuse identifiers. So the first thing we're going to do in our view controller is we're going to define 2 resource identifiers, one for the header and one for the footer. These are just simply strings that the collection view is going to use to associate these strings with our class. And the way we do that is we register them. So what we do when we create our collection view is we register a header and footer class with them like this. Okay, let's walk this slowly and see what's going on. So in load view, when we're creating our collection view, we're basically saying, hey, register my header class with this string called header reuse identifier. and also register something called myFooter class with a footer reuse identifier. So these strings now are tied to these classes. The connection's there. All we need to do now is supply them to the collection view when it needs them. Now it just so happens that collection view has a callback in its layout for querying and asking for a header and a footer view. So if we scroll down to our collection view delegate flow layout area, and we implement these optional protocols here, one called view for supplementary element of kind, this is where we tell the collection view, hey, if you're looking for a header, use my header class. And hey, if you're looking for a footer, use my footer class. And the way you'll know which one to return is based on its kind. So here's the key thing to understand about this. Header and footer in the context of flow layout, these are called supplementary elements. It's just a term that collection view uses. If you've got supplementary elements you want to add to your collection view, like a header or a footer, this is where I'm going to ask you for them. And what it does is it passes in a string representing the kind of supplemental view it's looking for. So if the supplemental view is an element kind of section header, and that's just a string that UICollectionView creates to represent a header, it's also got a corresponding one for footer. If you want to give me a header, then go ahead and DQ the header using that identifier above associated with this class. And this is just a simple switch statement here. So we're switching on the string of whether this is a header or a footer. And once we know what we're looking for, we can just DQ the class according to its respective identifier of either header or footer. And that's how it knows whether to take a header or a footer from what we're calling. So this is a really nice way of just using a simple switch statement. This would be even more elegant if it's an enum, but collection views have been around long, even before Swift was around. So we're just switching on strings here, but this is how we can return a header or a footer of supplementary kind when asked. Now there's just one more thing we need to do before this is going to work. We need to also specify how big our header and footer are. If we don't specify the size of our header and footer, that if the height is 0, the collection view is not going to show them. It's often a source of bugs. People are quite often left scratching their head. I know I was. Why are my headers and footers showing up? And it's because we didn't specify the size. So the way we specify the size is by telling it, and of course, collection view has a protocol dedicated to this too, one called reference size for header and section, and one called reference size for footer and section. And here we're free to specify the height of our header and footer. And if we run this now, we can see that we get a nice header, a blue header at the top of 80 points. And if we scroll down to the bottom somewhere here, there is our footer of 40. Voila, there you've got your header and your footer. Now, you might have noticed one thing. Look at the width here. How can I specify a width of 0? Like, why is the width not being respected here? And this is something that's just specific to collection views, and it has to do with the direction that you're scrolling. It turns out that when you're scrolling vertically like this, the only parameter that really matters here is the height. So collection view ignores anything to do with width. It just says, I'm not interested in your width, but I am interested in your height. So when we're scrolling vertically like this, height is the only dimension that's actually used here. If we had a horizontal scroll, then the width would be used and it would be flipped. But if you're wondering why you can put in a width of 10 here or a width of 60 and it doesn't actually affect the width and the sizing here, that's basically why. It's just the height and the view that are respected. Well, there you have it, folks. A very simple UICollectionView flow layout. And I know we went through a lot of stuff there today. And you might be wondering, why would I ever actually want to use this? Because so far, everything I've seen, this looks no different than UI table view. I find the UI table view actually simpler. It's been around a long time. I'm still not sure why I would want to use a UI collection view. Well, we needed to go through this, the simple flow layout, because next week, now that we've got this under our belt, we're going to be ready to take on some more advanced things. And we're actually going to go through a really good example in the next episode where we look at some of the very cool layouts that we can do with what's called a compositional layout, where basically this is the second concrete implementation to come out for UICollectionView. This just came out last year. And in there, we'll go and look at some very different cool ways that we can do some really complex layouts using this more compositional way. But anyways, we've got the start. We've got the basic flow layout under our belt. Come back next week and we'll dive into the mysteries of compositional layout and we'll see how that works. Okay, take care everyone. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.